defense is ready, Your Honor.
Your Honor, we're just waiting for John and Armstrong.
Court's reviewed all the case law regarding the statement made to police officers by Mr. Magistrate delivers the proper warnings, which the defendant was taken to in this case. The court determined that it was a custodial interrogation. The circumstances did indicate that the juvenile was under arrest, and a reasonable person would feel that he could have terminated the interview. However, he was under custodial interrogation. The magistrate took it properly. Took the statement alone with the defendant. Villa Gomez testified that, and I listened to the recording, she stated the recording numerous times. She reiterated the warnings to Mr. Armstrong. He parroted them back and appeared to understand them. He did, according to what the evidence showed, that he knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily waived each right and stated the warnings back to her. In regards to the invocation of the right to an attorney, the juvenile, Mr. Armstrong, showed, first of all, that he must have unambiguously requested counsel during the custodial interrogation to invoke his Fifth Amendment right to counsel. He did not do that. The court reviewed the totality of the circumstances in the viewpoint of an objectively reasonable police officer, and looking at all the facts, he did appear to understand. He was an intelligent young man, appeared to understand the warnings, did knowingly and voluntarily waive them. It was his Fifth Amendment right to invoke his right to counsel, which he did not. So therefore, the motion to suppress is denied. All right, and with that, are both sides ready for the jury?
Have we approached it?
Yes. Oh, yeah. 2 seconds.
I will do my best.
That would be fine.
please give us a few minutes. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna let you know, but you talk to Gary about maybe like 10 minutes before we start.
So it's new.
We do have an issue, we were going to talk to,
Okay, just tell me what.
we were going to talk to John about, before we talk to you, our ex-brother law is here.
Okay.
We just wanted to figure out from the state, of Canada, what witnesses that they thought we could talk about the alarm, and ask for permission to happen.
Certainly.
So we have to have John.
So again, just remind you days he's there. So we're all sending out to lunch at 1:15.
So I was talking to about my schedule. I'm gonna try to be this afternoon, probably when we break at 1:15. I'm gonna try to organize some and schedule so I can go through as much as possible.
Okay. Just let you know. That's all right.
No, it sure doesn't. Okay, hey, how's it like? Rick?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that ready for the jury?
That's ready, Your Honor.
It's ready, Your Honor.
All right, ready for jury.
Yes, ma'am.
Something about.
They did that right.
All rise for the jury.
You can all be seated wherever. We're standing for you. Two of you get the two lucky chairs on the ends. Actually, yeah. All right, please be seated. Well, good morning. How was your driving Miss Daisy moment this morning? Eventful?
Yes.
Okay, well, we can probably talk about that later. But otherwise, everything went well? You had no problems finding it?
A little.
Little? Okay. Well, the good news is you don't have to fight getting into this building. So I thought this might help, having it more coordinated in an off-site location and bringing you over. All right? Otherwise, no other problems this morning that administratively we need to address? All right, well, I hope you all had a very good weekend. I'm going to go over some housekeeping issues before we get started here. First of all, when you come in, we all obviously all stand. You're welcome to sit wherever you'd like. I do normally see that people take ownership of certain seats. So whatever you'd like, you're VIP and you're the one in charge here. So just take care of your area. We will take breaks. If at any time you can hear someone, you need them to speak up, you absolutely are the sole judges of the evidence and the credibility of the witnesses. So we want to make sure that you hear everything. So let us know, raise your hand. If you need a break earlier than when I give you a break, just let me know. And you obviously, yes ma'am.
I didn't realize this was from the Invoking opinion.
Okay, we'll get it for you. Could you get, thank you, no problem. We will take those breaks, but let me know. You can't stand up and just leave. Raise your hand and let me know, and we do all formally have to adjourn and let you all leave together, okay? Now, I do call balls and strikes up here, so if someone makes an objection, I'm not picking on which side is doing a better job. I'm merely ruling on what evidence is relevant at this phase of the trial, all right? If I do give you an instruction, please listen to that instruction carefully and consider that evidence only for that purpose. All right, and you'll know what I'm talking about when we get there. Now, you have notepads in front of you. We'll get yours in a minute. Notepads are important because, as we all heard growing up, the way that we recall information is from seeing, hearing, and writing. Now, there is only one true record in this trial, and that is what Ms. Rowland has taken down. There she is. All right, and I'm going to say that again because it's very important. There's only one true record, and that's what Ms. Rowland is taking down. So those notepads, unfortunately, when the case is formally given to you for deliberations, those notepads will be taken from you. They are only to help you recall information as you sit there and listen to it. But remember, because you're the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses, make sure that you keep an eye on the witness stand and observe those factors that we talked about in jury selection. Those notepads are good for things like dates, times, places, maybe words that you want to try to recall, things of that sort. But mainly, I'd like you to keep your attention on the witness stand and the evidence introduced. You are certainly welcome at the end of the trial. All the evidence that is introduced and admitted in trial is for you to review. So at the end of the trial, when the case is formally given to you, you only need to ask for a piece of evidence, and then I'll send it all back to you for your review. Now, in regards to that one and only record, at the end of the trial, when you are in deliberations, if you have a dispute amongst yourselves, I will send you back a formal dispute form. I tell you this now so that you'll remember this later, hopefully. And on that form, it will say what witness you had that issue about, who the attorney was that was asking the question of which you have a dispute about. You got it? And then what's your dispute? Gail will then look up in the record. It takes her a little while to find it. It's better now with find and replace. But she will search it. We will bring you back out here and read you only that portion that you are in dispute of, okay? We can't read, you can't say, I'd like to hear all of Officer so-and-so's testimony. That's not gonna happen, all right? It has to be just a disputed area of which you're talking about, okay? All right, also remember, on the breaks, you're certainly allowed to use your cell phones. Please keep them off while you're in the courtroom. This court may be crowded at times in the gallery. Please do not observe anybody in the audience. Please keep your focus on what's happening up here. That's the most important thing. Do not read or consult any media at any point during this trial. Everybody understand? All right, with all that, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you and each of you solemnly swear or affirm in the case of the state of Texas versus Antonio Armstrong Jr. will render a true verdict according to law and the evidence, so help you God? I do. All right, very well. Have a seat. All right, and when Mr. Armstrong, will you please stand? And the state, please arraign the defendant.
In the name and by the authority of the state of Texas, the duly organized grand jury of Harris County, Texas, presents in the District Court of Harris County, Texas, that in Harris County, Texas, Antonio Armstrong Jr., hereinafter styled the defendant, heretofore on or about July the 29th, 2016, did then and there unlawfully, during the same criminal transaction, intentionally and knowingly cause the death of Antonio Armstrong Sr. by shooting him with a deadly weapon, to wit, a firearm, and intentionally and knowingly causing the death of Dawn Armstrong by shooting her with a deadly weapon, to wit, a firearm, against the peace and dignity of the state, and is signed by the foreman of the grand jury.
To which the defendant pleads guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Thank you, sir. You may have a seat. State, you wish to make an opening?
To do, Your Honor, may we approach just
You may.
very briefly?
Ready? It's in my ear. Okay. Are there any witnesses in the audience that intend to testify? Please stand. There are. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the rule has been invoked, and just so that you know what that means, that just means, I'll talk as long as possible, that witnesses are prohibited from talking to each other about their impending testimony, and then once they testify, they still cannot talk to each other about their testimony until the trial is concluded. All right? And both sides, please notify witnesses of that instruction.
Yes, Your Honor.
And that state may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. On July 28th of 2016, the alarm was set in the home of Dawn and Antonio Armstrong. It was armed, and it was set to something called stay. And what that tells the alarm is that, listen, we don't want people coming into our house. The doors are monitored, the windows are monitored. If somebody breaks in, you need to call the police. The sirens need to go off. We need help. However, it also tells the alarm that we're here, we're staying home, and we're going to move around inside of the house. So motion detectors, don't call the police if we go to the bathroom. Don't call the police if we go to the kitchen. However, you might know if you have an alarm and done this before. However, if you decide to go outside and you open that door, you breach that seal, then oops, it doesn't know that. It thinks somebody's coming in, not going out, and it calls the police. And at 9:52 on July 28th of 2016, that's what the alarm system was told, is we're home, we're staying inside. Please keep people out. And so in the home that night was Dawn Armstrong and Antonio Armstrong Sr. And they eventually went to bed on their second floor bedroom. And also in the home that night was the defendant, their 16-year-old son, Antonio Armstrong Jr. And he was in his third floor bedroom. So this is a 3-floor house. Living area on the bottom, first floor. Second floor is the master bedroom, an office outside of it, where Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong slept in the master bedroom. On the opposite side of the house on the second floor was Kyra. It's a 12-year-old daughter. She was at home as well. Her bedroom's on the opposite end of the second floor from the Armstrongs. And then there's the defendant whose bedroom is kind of a loft, a large loft game room area turned into a bedroom on the third floor. And so at 9:52 on 7/28 of 2016, the alarm was told, we're safe, we're sound, we're here to stay, protect us from the outside. Part of protecting us from the outside is the front door was locked, and the back door was locked on the first floor. The windows, and let me back up, locked and monitored. The door to the garage, monitored. The windows on the first floor, closed, locked. Screens on the outside, monitored by the system. On the second floor, windows not monitored on the second floor. Windows are 13, 14 feet up in the air. But windows, when they went to bed that night, closed, locked. Screens on the outside on the second floor. Third floor. One thing on the third floor really is the defendant's room. Window closed. Screen on it. So that was the safety bubble that had been set up by the Armstrongs when they went to bed that night. Dawn was, as you stand at the end of the bed, Dawn was on the left side. Dawn Armstrong, the defendant's mother, was on the left side of the bed. And She was shot twice in the head while she laid there safe and sound and healthy. She probably never knew it was her son that killed her. Next to her, as you stand at the bottom of the bed, next to her to the right side of the bed, laid her husband, Antonio Sr. He was shot one time in the head. He did not immediately die. The gun that was used to kill Dawn Armstrong came from inside the house. It was Antonio Sr.'s gun. The gun that was used to shoot Antonio Sr. in the head was his gun, came from inside the house. The alarm never went off. The alarm did what it was supposed to. It protected them from things outside of the house from coming in. At 1:40 in the morning, we've gone past midnight. It's July 29th of 2016 now. At 1:40 in the morning, the defendant called 911. The defendant called 911. Told 911 I heard shots in my parents' room. I'm hiding in my closet. The alarm hadn't gone off. Police arrived minutes later, and they set up a perimeter around the house. And the police started to learn some things immediately about the house. And you can imagine how this situation was. The police have people inside of a house. Shots have been fired, and from their perspective, it's possibly a very dangerous situation for everybody. Maybe the people inside of the house, certainly the officers going into a house where they think there may be a firearm. But what they learn as they get there is the front door is still locked. And they're kind of looking around for forced entry. Is this a home invasion? Is this a burglary? Is this a robbery? What is this? And there is none. See, the windows don't seem to be broken. Screens are on. Front door's locked. We can't get in. And in fact, what they find out is, because they're talking to the 911 operator who's talking to the defendant. And the 911 operator's giving them information. And so what they find out is, they want the kids to come out. They want the defendant to come out, and they find out about his sister, and they want his sister to come out too, because they don't know what's happened at this point. They want them to be safe. But they can't get into the house because the doors are locked and the alarm system's on. And so what has to happen before the police can go in is the defendant has to come down, and the defendant has to disarm the system, which he does. And the police, he comes to the front door with the sister, and he unlocks it, and the police get him out. And they go in. And what the police find when they go in, of course, they find Dawn, who is now dead. And they find Antonio Sr., who is fighting for his life in the bed. But they search the house, and they find nobody. What they do find is they look at the windows, and they find that they're very nice window treatment, shades that seem to be perfectly in place. And they find windows closed. And they find windows locked from inside. And what they find is the house is the same way it was at 952. The killer didn't come from outside of the house. Well, another thing that they find is they find the gun left behind by the killer. It doesn't necessarily make sense to them because they're not used to the killer being within. They're used to somebody coming in, so the killer left the gun. And it's on the kitchen counter, and it's with a little note that's kind of scribbled. Looked like somebody tried to do I'm 4 years old and I write like this. I've been watching you for a long time. The police are thinking somebody that came in and committed a murder, left the gun, and left a note to scare the people that he just killed. This doesn't make any sense. And they continue to go through the house, and they go through the first floor, and there's nobody there, and they go through the second floor. And when they're on the second floor, they discover, a very sharp officer sees a hole in the ceiling. And he sees a bullet in the carpet. Now, this isn't the crime scene. This isn't the master bedroom. This is outside of the master bedroom. And so the police officers, they see a hole, and they see a projectile, and the common sense kind of tells them that the bullets are sometimes called projectiles, the bullet came this way. And later on, what the police officers are going to find out is that on the other side of that hole, on the third floor, is the defendant's room. And that hole's covered up by a pile of socks. This really weird kind of pyramid of socks. And so the officers, they've still got their guns, and they're still going through the house trying to figure out what happened. And you're going to hear about how they discover the body. Antonio Sr. is still fighting for his life. And you're going to hear about how it starts to not make sense to them, and one of the more senior officers finally figures it out. It finally hits them. Whoa, separate those kids. Because it does make sense now. We came to a locked, sealed house, and there were 4 people in it. One of them was dead. They know that 12-year-old Kyra, who I haven't talked a lot about, that's sister, they know she was asleep because the 911 operator heard the defendant waking her up and saying, "We got to get out of here. Just follow me." And she didn't know what was going on. So the police officer starts to figure it out, and he puts it together. And then he starts thinking about the hole in the ceiling, and the windows being locked from the inside, and the screens being on, and the alarm system having to be turned off. And quickly, the officer focuses on the killer. He has no choice. Antonio Sr. dies from his wounds. From his wound, a single gunshot to the head. So police begin the long process of reviewing evidence. They've got to collect everything that they find at the scene, and they try to pick up as many things as they can, and inevitably they don't get everything. You can't pick up every piece of everything at the house, but they try. And then the long process of testing it, and everybody expects DNA and fingerprints, but the police discover a couple of things. Number one, we're looking for DNA and fingerprints of a killer who lives in the house. That's not going to really help us a whole lot, because we should expect to find DNA and fingerprints of the killer when he lives in the house. And the other thing that they find is a tried and true, it's something that police discover all the time, which, you know who controls the scene of a capital murder? It's the defendant. And so evidence can be wiped down. Clothes can be changed. The person that controls how much evidence is left behind is the defendant, always. Just depends on how much they think about it. So there's that alarm thing that the police want to look at. And sure enough, the alarm system, actually the Armstrongs paid for an upgrade, and it was monitored. And even when it was set to "we're staying home," the motion detectors inside still detected motion. It didn't call the police, but the alarm company, the computer, gets a notice when the motion detectors detect something. And there are 2 motion detectors in the house. One is to cover the downstairs, and it's kind of put in a corner up there, and it covers the downstairs area, including the entrance from the garage and from the front door. It'd be just like this. This is the front door, this is the garage door. The detector's there, and it kind of covers that area. And then there's these stairs that go right up to the second floor, right after you enter the house, okay? And so it kind of covers that area. And then you go up, and in the corner on the second story, where the murders occurred, there's another detector. And that detector, it's also up in a corner, and you'll see it. And that detector catches two areas. There's a hallway outside of the master bedroom. And that detector catches two areas. It catches if someone goes up the stairs, they get up the stairs, and then they turn the corner, the detector on the second floor catches them. So if you come from downstairs, you get caught. And then on the other end of that hallway, so that's on this end of the hallway, you come up the stairs and you turn towards the master bedroom, you get caught. On the other end of the hallway is a stairway that goes up to the defendant's room. If you come down from the defendant's room and you step towards the bottom of his staircase, you get caught. And so police started to look at those records and see what the alarm could tell us. And the alarm tells us more than just the killer came from inside of the house. The alarm tells us that the killer came from upstairs. Why do we know that? Because at 1:09 a.m., the upstairs motion detector goes off. Why is it important that the upstairs motion detector went off? You know what? None of the doors were opened. None of the windows were opened. The downstairs motion detector didn't go off. Nobody came from the first floor up. The motion occurred on the second floor. And so when the defendant came down the stairs from his room and got to the bottom of his stairwell, the motion detector caught him. And that's 1:09 a.m. At 1:25 a.m., the downstairs motion detectors go off. No doors opened, no windows opened. Somebody, the killer, walked from the second story down to the first story. Remember where the gun was left? In the kitchen. Now, another important time here, I'm not going to overwhelm you with time, but 1:40. Do you remember 1:40? That was the 911 call, where the defendant said, I just heard shots in my parents' room. What happened between 1:09, when the upstairs detectors went off, and 1:40, when the defendant said he heard shots? That's a long time to be able to write a note, put a gun downstairs, change clothes, whatever you need to do. You know, one more thing that I didn't mention about, I have to jump back, when the police got there, when they very first entered the room to try to find Dawn and Antonio Armstrong Sr., they noticed they had pillows on their heads. That really means something. You're a murderer and you put pillows on somebody's heads. Maybe you don't want to see what you did. So, after the 911 call, the police get there. The defendant said he heard shots in his parents' room. Police get there in a matter of minutes. The scene here tells the story. At 9:52, the alarm was told by somebody figuratively, we're home and we're safe. It's your job to protect us from somebody outside coming in and hurting us. And when the Armstrongs went to bed that night. I'm sure they felt comfortable. The kids were home. Alarm was on. And I'm sure never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that the alarm couldn't protect them because they're going to be killed by their own child. And Dawn probably didn't know it, never realized it. Hopefully Antonio Sr. never realized it. That alarm could not protect them from the outside, could not protect them from the inside.
Before any of the evidence was in, within minutes, and I mean minutes, of Antonio Jr. walking out of his house, the Houston Police Department had already made up their mind. Within minutes of walking out of that house, the Houston Police Department decided he was the suspect in this case. The evidence is going to show you that an officer testified in a previous hearing that within 11 minutes, within 11 minutes of going into that house, before any evidence was processed, before they knew anything about the crime scene as far as forensics, before anything, they made up their mind he did it. 11 minutes. Now, what does that mean for purposes of the evidence? It means they created a confirmation bias immediately in a high-profile murder case. The evidence is going to show that HPD knew that the media was interested in this case. And within 11 minutes, they had already decided who did it. They knew nothing about the alarm system. They knew nothing about the physical evidence in the house. They knew nothing about the scientific testing. They knew nothing. But they anchored themselves immediately, in this case, that Antonio did it. We talked about this in jury selection. They formed the opinion without all the relevant information. And then they shaped this case to fit their opinion. Because they made a decision like that. All the evidence was not in. So Mr. Brewer described the murder of two people at close range. And Mr. Brewer said, we don't expect to have any DNA or any fingerprints. Just kind of brushed that off. Confirmation bias. There is no fingerprints matching AJ on the weapon. There's no fingerprints matching Antonio Jr. on the shells. There's no evidence of fingerprints matching Antonio Jr. on anything related to that gun. The slide, the magazine, the handle, none. There is no DNA of Antonio Jr. on that gun. on the bullets, on the magazine, on the slide. You're going to hear something in the evidence about contact DNA when you handle something. Now, sure, Mr. Brewer said he could have wiped it down or washed his hands. The evidence is going to show you that in a previous hearing, the lead homicide detective in this case, Detective Dagnall, said he looked at all the sinks. They were bone dry. There was no indication anywhere in that house that he washed his hands. You're going to hear evidence about gunshot residue. When an individual fires a weapon, the gases expand, and it gets on your clothes, your forearms, your hands, your hair, can get everywhere. The evidence is going to show you that in an enclosed environment, where there's no wind, no environmental factors, there's a greater chance of you having gunshot residue on your body or your hands. You're going to see photographs of Antonio Jr. with his hands bagged. But again, you're going to find out that there was no evidence of gunshot residue on Antonio Jr. Not on his hands, not on his shirt, not on his clothes. Most importantly, they're going to claim that these people were shot at close range. There's no blood. None. There's no kickback anywhere on Antonio Jr. or his clothes. They had full control over that house. Houston Police Department had complete control over that house. They could have searched anywhere in that house. They could have searched any clothes. They could have used any type of testing to determine if there's blood anywhere. Because if there's blood of his parents in his room, it's over. Let's go home. Don't need me. Why am I here? It's a slam dunk. There is no evidence of his parents' blood anywhere around him, on him, or in his room, or anywhere. For them to say that they couldn't search anything is ridiculous. Another example of confirmation bias. You're going to hear about a doctor who was related, not related, but knew Antonio Sr. through her boyfriend. And I'm not going to get into those details, but she had a relationship, friendly relationship with Antonio Sr. She's going to tell you when she came out of town from a trip out of the country, while this young man was in jail, she found a note on her Jeep. Said something like, "We were watching you." They'll agree it wasn't AJ. Couldn't be. Her boyfriend, a guy named Tony, building a gym, he sees on the window in dust something like, "We are watching you." He's in custody. They didn't tell you about that. Why not? Think that's relevant to a capital murder case? Is that something you'd want to figure out? Is that reasonable doubt as to what happened in this case? Evidence will show you that they didn't care much about what that lady had to say, because it didn't fit into their theory, their confirmation bias of the case. You're going to hear evidence that Antonio Sr. owned a gym. And shortly after he passed and after the funeral, the gym was broken into. And there's a video that shows the front of the gym two people break into the gym. They smash the window. And I'll let you watch the video, but the evidence will show they're looking for something. And they're masked men. They are masked men. Why is that important, Rick? Because AJ tells the police there was a masked man in the house. Reasonable doubt. You'll get to see that. The relationship between my client, Antonio Jr., and his parents will be at issue in this case. And Antonio Jr.'s demeanor on the day of the offense, in which they claim he executed his parents in cold blood. You're going to hear from Antonio Jr.'s girlfriend. You're going to hear from her mom. That night, the night of the murders, Antonio Jr. was on the phone with them. And they're going to say his demeanor was normal. He was goofing around. They were joking around. One of them is going to describe him as being a goofball. You're also going to hear that they continue to text up into minutes, 30, 45 minutes, before they say he committed the crime of executing his parents. Girlfriend's going to tell you he was being goofy. Goofy AJ. Typical teenage text between boyfriend and girlfriend. Now, I'll ask you to ask them, is that demeanor consistent with someone who would, 30 minutes later, execute their parents? That's reasonable doubt. That's reasonable doubt. The alarm system. You're going to hear a lot of evidence about the alarm system. I'm just going to tell you that the evidence will show you what they told you is not accurate. You're going to hear about the holes in that alarm system and the reliability of that alarm system and how it functions. You're also going to hear that they failed to get the records in time. They're going to have some preliminary records, but records were destroyed by the alarm company in the normal course of business, and they did not get them. Confirmation bias. The most important thing you're going to hear is about access to the house and how it applies to someone else in this case. You're going to hear evidence that the outside of the actual garage door, where you pull in the cars, there's a keypad. And the family's going to tell you that the Armstrongs typically gave out that keypad to a lot of people. And from opening the garage with the keypad, they could get into the house through the garage door that enters into the house. And that door was routinely left unlocked, and they used the garage door as a way to let people in and out. You're going to hear about a lot of people who had access to it. But you're going to hear about one person, his name is Josh. Josh is AJ's brother. And you're going to hear evidence that for the past 3 years, he's been in and out of a psychiatric facility. You're going to hear evidence that he's suicidal. You're going to hear evidence that he's homicidal. You're going to hear evidence that he's catatonic. You're going to hear evidence that he has a woman in his head that he's trying to kill. You're going to hear evidence from family members that have lived with him over the past 3 years. And they're going to tell you about Josh's demeanor and his actions and what they do to protect himself. Josh had access to the house just like AJ did. In fact, Josh showed up at the scene the night this happened. In fact, the investigators interviewed him, well, for about 3 or 4 minutes. They initially thought something was going on with him because they bagged his hands. But what they didn't know was Josh's psychiatric history that was coming. They didn't know that Josh lived less than 2 minutes away from the house. The evidence is going to show you that you can run from Josh's apartment to the Armstrongs in less than a minute. Outside of that stuff, the 2 most important things I think the evidence is going to show you about Josh is that, number 1, when asked by a Houston Police Department officer where he was at the time of the murders, he refused to answer. He refused to answer. To me, the most important thing about Josh that I would need to know, and this goes to your common sense as people, he didn't go visit his dad when he was in the hospital fighting for his life. He did not show up. His dad was just shot, fighting to live. He did not come to the hospital. Why? Why would he not come to the hospital and not why? Right before that, would he not tell the police where he was at the time of the murders? Reasonable doubt.
Objection argument, Your Honor.
Sustained.
You're going to hear about evidence that HPD didn't bother to look at, about people they didn't bother to interview. You're going to hear that as we speak, on a case that's 3 years old, they're still trying to interview us. They're accusing this young man of capital murder, and they're still trying to interview people about this case. Confirmation bias and reasonable doubt is weaved throughout this whole case. They accused AJ of murdering his parents before all the evidence was in. And we know what they didn't know at the time. We know what they can't prove right now. We also know that 11 minutes in, they didn't know he was not guilty. Thank you for your time. And we anticipate, after hearing all the evidence in this case, you will find Antonio Jr. not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeTono. State, call your first witness.
Please call Sergeant Horlick to the stand, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, actually, we're going to take just a brief break, so please retire the jury.
All rise for the jury.
Please be seated. Court's in recess for 5 minutes.